So, before we begin, can I please remind member and witnesses to turn off your mobile phones? Interference from mobile phones obviously affects sound quality and transmission for the meeting. I'd like to take the opportunity to welcome back to the committee Seamus Coffey. You're accompanied today by your fellow council members Sebastian Barnes, Martina Lawless, Michael Tutty and Eddie Casey. And obviously today we are meeting with IFAC to discuss its November fiscal assessment report. Your report raises a number of concerns in relation to the government budgetary policy. Today, our Committee of Budget Oversight will engage with you and your members, teasing out these issues. We acknowledge, as always, IFAC's engagement with our committee. As you know, you are regular and frequent visitors to us. We do appreciate that, and we also appreciate you for accommodating us with this request in the schedule. We obviously want to identify certain strategic issues from the Budget Oversight Committee's perspective that we will be able to raise with the Minister for Finance and Public Expenditure and Reform in terms of opportunities to improve the framework for parliamentary scrutiny of the budget. Now, I have this piece of housekeeping which I always have to do. So just before we hear opening statements, just to draw your attention to the position and privilege which applies, I wish to advise you that by virtue of section 17(2) of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect to their evidence to the committee. However, if you are directed by the committee to cease giving evidence on a particular matter and continue to do so, you are entitled thereafter only to qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that, where possible, you should not criticise or make charges against any person or entity by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. Members are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that they should not comment or criticise or make charges against a person outside the Houses, and either unofficial or an official by name, in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. So, with that piece of housekeeping over, Mr. Coffey, I would now like you to make your opening statement. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you very much for the members of the committee for the invitation to come before you again. So, on behalf of the Council, I'd like to again thank you for the opportunity for meeting us. And joining me today are Mr. Sebastian Barnes, Dr. Martina Lawless, Mr. Michael Tutty, who are all Council members, Mr. Eddie Casey, our Chief Economist and Head of Secretariat. Members of the Council Secretariat are also present, Mr. Niall Conroy, Mr. Kevin Timoney, Ms. Anoa Ozes-Arantz, Ms. Frederica Vulgar and Mr. Killian Carroll. We continue to value these engagements. The Council published its 15th Fiscal Assessment Report on the 28th of November. The report covers all aspects of the Council's mandate as set out in the Fiscal Responsibility Acts of 2012 and 2013. At the start, it is important to note that the Council's mandate does not cover commenting on choice of individual tax measures or spending items or priorities, but rather comment on the overall fiscal stance. There have been significant improvements to macroeconomic conditions in recent years. The Council assesses that the pick-up in growth since about 5 years ago has been driven by a cyclical recovery in demand. These improvements have been most visible in the labour market, with unemployment falling to about 5.5%. Most plausible estimates suggest that the domestic economy has been growing faster than its potential rate since 2014 and is now, in 2018, close to its potential. Central forecasts suggest it will move beyond potential from 2019 onwards, with overheating emerging in later years. While short-term growth prospects look favourable, there are significant risks evident in both directions, and a slowdown in coming years is inevitable. Significant overheating pressures could build up if a faster than expected pick-up in housing construction materialises. On the other hand, Brexit could be more costly than assumed. There are also risks posed by the concentration of Ireland's exporting sector in a handful of specialised areas, the global rise in protectionism and possible further change in the international tax environment. Substantial progress was made from 2008 to 2015 to move the public finances to a safer position. The government is close to a balanced budget, debt ratios look to be on a downward trajectory, and near-term growth and interest prospects are still relatively favourable. Though efforts to stabilise the public finances since the crisis have proven successful, improvements on the budgetary front have stalled since 2015. This comes despite a strong recovery in the economic cycle, both domestically and internationally, in addition to a supportive monetary policy environment. Non-interest spending has risen at essentially the same pace as tax revenue since 2015, so that the strong cyclical recovery, favourable external environment have not led to any notable improvement in the underlying budgetary position. It is clear that recent revenue growth has been supported by short-term cyclical developments and a possibly transient surge in corporation tax receipts. Looking through these effects, the underlying budgeted position would appear to have deteriorated since 2015. Budget 2019 forecasts indicate that a small deficit is to be run again next year, with a surplus now planned for 2020. It is notable that Budget 2016 had planned a budget surplus for 2018. Budget 2017 had planned a budget surplus for 2019. And Budget 2018 had planned a surplus for 2020. These delays come against a backdrop of stalling improvements, while Ireland's debt burden is still amongst the highest in the OECD. When set against a more appropriate measure of national income, like GNI star, Ireland's net debt burden for 2017 is close to 100% and remains the 5th highest in the OECD, behind only Portugal, Italy, Japan and Greece. Two recent developments in the budgetary front have contributed to a further slowdown in improvements on the budgetary side. The first, a substantial within-year increase in spending in 2018, and the second, a larger than planned budget package for 2019. Shortly before the budget, the government decided to increase spending in 2018 by a further £1.1 billion beyond what was originally envisaged just 4 months earlier. The increases were largely due to health overruns. While some variation relative to initial plans is inevitable, these expenditure increases are likely to be long-lasting. Within-year increases in expenditure of this nature should be funded through sustainable increases in taxation, reallocation of existing spending, or reduced spending increases in later years. The Council assesses that the within-year spending increases this year are not consistent with prudent budgetary management. For 2019, the Council set out in its pre-budget 2019 statement how an appropriate fiscal policy could be arrived at. The Council noted that the economy was close to its potential, the budget deficit was almost closed, and that the structural budget position would appear to be near balance. It noted that little further adjustment would be required to close an underlying deficit or to enable a steady pace of reduction in the government debt ratio. To maintain this position, net policy spending could rise at or below the pace of sustainable revenues. Various estimates would put this at approximately 3.5% per annum in real terms. When combined with inflation, this would imply a limit of up to £3.5 billion for spending or tax cuts for 2019, or a 4.5% increase. By not indexing the tax system, revenue would be raised, thus enabling a further £0.6 billion spending increase over and above that limit. This total of almost £4 billion is far from what we have considered a tight budgetary constraint. The actual budget day package for 2019 amounted to £1.1 billion. This was higher than the £0.8 billion package that was planned prior to the budget. Taken together, the within-year increases introduced in 2018 and the larger than assumed budget package in budget 2019 exceed the limit that the Council has assessed as appropriate. Government spending is now planned to increase, net of tax measures, by £4.5 billion in 2019, compared to what was originally planned for 2018. This compares to the £3.5 billion that the Council had assessed as an appropriate limit. And if additional spending measures beyond the quantity in the Summer Economic Statement 2018 were to be addressed, the Council assessed that these could have been funded by additional tax increases or through reallocations of existing spending. The Department of Finance's own Budget 2019 estimates also indicated that government plans were not consistent with complying with the fiscal rules for 2018 and 2019. The government should aim to comply with the fiscal rules as a minimum standard when setting its budgetary plans. A separate assessment by the European Commission has since assessed that 2017 outturns and 2018 plans showed a number of possible breaches of the fiscal rules, but that the 2019 plans were compliant. The European Commission also expressed concern about the overspending within the health sector, noting that much of the better-than-expected revenue for 2018 is being used to fund within-year current expenditure increases in healthcare, which raises concerns both about the long-term fiscal sustainability and the pace of adoption of the strategy. The Council's assessment of the fiscal stance is based on a broader economic assessment than just a mechanical application of the fiscal rules. The Council has highlighted on a number of occasions that the fiscal rules at this stage in the cycle are becoming less helpful for the overall sustainability of the public finances. Focusing on the right budgetary stance and being prepared to be more cautious than the fiscal rules allow is the correct approach for the government to follow over the medium term. This is particularly true given that the strict legal application of the current fiscal rules uses the EU's commonly agreed methodology for potential output estimation, which will not prevent a repeat of pro-cyclical policy mistakes made in the past. The Minister for Finance echoed these concerns in his foreword to the Summer Economic Statement 2018, noting that We must continue to be prudent in relation to management of the public finances. The fiscal rules are currently unhelpful in this regard. A full and literal application of the fiscal rules would involve the adoption of pro-cyclical policies not remotely appropriate to our position in the economic cycle. The repeated failures to prevent unplanned spending increases have resulted in long-lasting increases in spending, which are difficult to reverse. These failures represent a repeat of the policy mistakes of the past. Pressures in the health sector and elsewhere should be funded through sustainable tax revenues or decreases in spending categories elsewhere. These unfunded spending increases have left the public finances more exposed to adverse shocks, with the budget balance in deficit rather than in surplus. Health spending for 2018 is set to exceed the level of spending budgeted for yet again. The Department of Health has experienced numerous overruns historically, and the problem of unrealistic forecasts, coupled with a soft budget constraint, has undermined the credibility of expenditure ceilings. Given previous experience, there is a strong possibility that health spending will exceed its budget forecasts in 2019. In addition, the Christmas bonus, which will be paid in full this year, has not been budgeted for in 2019. Somewhat disappointing that the Oireachtas will pass a budget over the coming weeks that excludes a significant amount of spending that everyone in this room knows will happen. These two items alone pose significant upward risks to expenditure forecasts for 2019. The Council welcomes the return in Budget 2019 to forecasting 5 years ahead. The Council also wishes to acknowledge the substantial progress that the Department of Finance has made in terms of macroeconomic forecasting. The Department has developed and published its own estimates of the supply side of the economy. This means that better measures of medium-term economic growth and of the underlying state of the economy can be used to inform policy. However, the Government's budgetary plans for later years lack credibility. Specifically, the medium-term spending forecasts are based on technical assumptions that look and are unrealistic. Expenditure is assumed to grow at a modest pace, resulting in increasing surpluses in later years. The expenditure growth forecast for the later years would only barely cover the Council's standstill estimates of the cost of maintaining current service levels, given demographic and price pressures. The current intention to run budget surpluses for the foreseeable future, if conditions allow, is vague. Previous commitments to outperform the requirements of the EU fiscal rules and to reduce debt to 55% of GDP over the medium term are no longer referenced. In addition, the Government system of 3-year budget ceilings is not working, with repeated pro-cyclical upward revisions to ceilings. The Council welcomes the introduction of the Rainy Day Fund, the National Surplus Exceptional Contingencies Reserve Fund. Though it is potentially useful, the current design is insufficient to offset faster than prudent growth rates allowed under the spending rule, as is currently applied. And annual allocations of the fund have been lowered from previously planned amounts, despite a surge in corporation tax receipts. To conclude, I thank the committee again for providing us with the opportunity to attend today, and we look forward to taking questions and hearing the views of members.
Thank you. Now, I have a number of people indicating to me that they'd like to come in. Just to remind members, I'm going to do what I normally do in this situation, approximately 5 minutes. We will come back to people for additional rounds of questions, but just to try and let everybody in initially first. So the first person who had indicated to me was Deputy McGrath.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to welcome Mr Coffey and his colleagues, and to compliment you on what is a very impactful report, full of analysis and detail, and I think all of the arguments are comprehensively backed up. If I can just start with the issue of corporation tax, Mr Coffey, particularly in light of the Exchequer returns yesterday again, and you know, the government put forward the defence that you, in a personal capacity, were commissioned by government to do a report in 2017, and you said at that stage that essentially the level of corporation tax receipts, the step change in 2015, would be sustainable out to 2020. But as you can see from the figures, we've had a few step changes since then. And so the question for you is whether or not you still believe that the corporation tax receipts are sustainable. So you wrote that report based on the 2016 numbers. At that point, we collected about 7.4 billion. This year, we'll probably break the 10 billion mark, looking at the profile for December, which is 600 million. So we'll probably break 10 billion. So we'll be up over a third on the 2016 figures on which you based your assessment that receipts were sustainable. So can you give us your perspective on that issue now? Is it your view, is it the view of the Council, that corporation tax receipts are sustainable, and to what extent is there a real risk for the Irish economy that we are again building up permanent expenditure commitments which recur again and again on the back of receipts that could well prove to be temporary, and we know they're volatile.
So I suppose you're asking for two separate views there. That's my own personal view based on the report I wrote previously, and the view of the Council. So primarily I'm here today to represent the views of the Fiscal Council, and we've clearly highlighted this as a risk, and I suppose we've referenced that it has echoes of the past with reliance on significant amounts of receipts from one tax source. So it looks like this year, as you say, corporation tax will be about 18% of exchequer tax revenue. So it's supporting a huge amount of spending in the economy. If I take off my IFAC hat and go back to the report as published last year on the sustainability, I believe I was before either this committee or the Finance Committee on the sustainability of receipts within the past year. And my view from the report wouldn't really have changed. I would consider the corporation tax is a volatile tax. It is likely to go down at some stage, but I would continue to be of the view that the receipts are sustainable to at least 2020. Now, admittedly, the level is different, so that means the risk is higher. But given that the step change occurred in 2015, it has been seen repeatedly since then. The evidence would suggest that the point made around 2016, 2017 that it was sustainable to 2020 holds. But I do think the level of risk from a Fiscal Council perspective, the level of risk keeps getting higher as the amounts keep getting bigger. Like, it is good to be getting this money. Much better to be collecting 10 billion of corporation tax than not. I think from a Fiscal Council perspective, our view would be to be aware of the risks it possesses. The report didn't explain where the money came from. We've seen a huge surge, and as it stands, we have limited knowledge as to why it happened. And if we have limited knowledge as to why it happened, well, it could go back down. So the concern from a Fiscal Council perspective will be introducing permanent increases in spending on the basis of these potentially temporary revenue sources. And that's what we've seen over the last number of years. We've referenced the fact that the delay in moving the public accounts into surplus, and that hasn't been because of a deterioration in the economy. That naturally could have happened. Like, the surplus has been pushed back even though the economy has performed stronger, and we have these huge source additional corporation tax receipts. So the reason for the delay is policy, not the economic environment. So I would hold the view that the receipts are sustainable. 2020 isn't that far away now, so I'm not putting myself too much out in the block at this stage. But the views in that report, nothing to date would lead me to change the conclusions made there.
Okay, Chair, two other questions. I'll put them together if you like. One is just in relation to the possible impact of Brexit and the fact that the budget is based on the central scenario of relatively benign outcome, a transition period followed by a deal with essentially free trade terms. So to what extent do you think the government should have provided what-if analysis, sensitivity analysis, what the impact would be in 2019 if all of this goes wrong? So we have the vote next week, and that's not looking positive, and then we'll see what happens after that. But there is a distinct possibility we could be facing a cliff-edge Brexit, and so the whole basis of the budget will become obsolete overnight if that happens. And yet, when you read through all of the budget documentation, you don't see any analysis of that and the scenarios that would throw up. So if you can give an observation on that. And then final question is on the expenditure side. So you're very critical of the within-year changes in expenditure, the growth in expenditure, principally accounted for by health, again, in the region of 700 million. But if the government were to put it to you, what are they to do when the HSE run out of money with a few months to go, and we're all aware of the pressures in the health service, life-saving operations, essential treatments being provided for people. So what's your argument in response to that, and how do we prevent this happening year in and year out? Thank you.
If I could take the Brexit question. It is true that all of the forecasts both by the Department of Finance and endorsed by the Fiscal Council were based on what seemed like a very reasonable scenario, central scenario of a transition agreement, an extension until 2021, and then some sort of deal. Obviously, given that it's a very fast-moving environment, it's difficult to kind of update those what-if scenarios. We'll know more, obviously, with the parliamentary vote next Tuesday. In terms of the sort of effects it could have on the Irish economy and in terms of throwing the budget out of date, The work that was done by the Department of Finance and the ESRI in terms of the overall effect of Brexit on the Irish economy showed long-term reductions in GDP in the order of 4%. Those were all based on a sort of a stable transition period and a long-term effect. If we see analysis in the UK released just last week by the Bank of England, they took what had been a similar analysis of a transition period and a smooth Brexit and looked at what would be the additional effects of a sort of a cliff-edge, disorderly Brexit next March. And they effectively doubled the size of their negative impact on the UK economy. It's, I think, not unreasonable to assume, given the level of integration between the Irish and the UK economies, that something similar would happen to the Irish forecasts if they were updated to include a sort of disorderly Brexit. A lot of the...
You're saying it would double, you think?
I think it would be reasonable to think that it would double the size of the effect. A lot of the impact that they were taking into consideration in terms of why it would increase the impact so much was in terms of the length of time it would take firms to adjust to delays on the border in terms of checks and customs. Given the amount of Irish trade that transits the UK, any delays in UK port processing times would potentially have a knock-on effect on Irish trade routes as well. So that's very much, and our report does highlight as a risk that there is a central scenario. It seems reasonable based on the odds of a deal and a transition period being put in place, but that the current estimates of how large the impact would be on the economy in the long term could be understated if this deal doesn't come to play and there's a kind of a cliff-edge Brexit next March.
I take the question on health expenditure. I mean, obviously, if there are overruns every year, there's something wrong in the system, and the system needs to be changed. And the Department of Finance itself, or also Public Expenditure and Reform, has published a paper on this subject, looking at why is this happening and what do we need to do. And undoubtedly, the forecasts each year are not based on reality. You don't find 700 million just suddenly arriving as the year goes on. There must have been a shortfall right from the start in terms of the figures. So we need to find a mechanism whereby correct for reasonable forecasts are given in the budget rather than unrealistic ones. Now, I know from my days in the Department of Finance that the department can be at fault in saying, no, you can't have all that money, and HSE has to go away and see, can we cut back? And then they find they can't cut back, so you get overruns. So there may be fault on both sides. But certainly there needs to be much more supervision of the expenditure as the year goes on, so that you're not just finding out in October that there's a big overrun, that it's flagged as the year goes on and that you have time to take action. Because in October there certainly isn't time to cut back on other expenditures or to raise more revenue. So I think we need to look at how the whole health expenditure estimates are formed and how they are supervised and managed over the year. Even the Fiscal Council, I think, wouldn't find ways of offsetting it if you only identify it in October.
Yeah, and just to echo what my colleague Michael has said, like, we're not absolutionists when it comes to overruns. The government's budget is very large. We don't expect every line to match the amount set out at the start of the year. We focus on the overall amount. The issue we have, as Michael says, with the health area is the systematic nature of these overruns, that they happen every year. But in a budget of this large, you are going to have some things that will be higher, some things that will be lower. We would expect that the overall aggregate would be close to what was set out at the start, that you should be able to accommodate those through one form or another. And to some extent that happened last year, like these overruns happen repeatedly. There were supplementary estimates last year, but the overall amount of expenditure didn't increase dramatically last year. What we have this year is supplementaries in health and in a range of other areas, and they're all adding to the full amount of spending almost, that there are no savings elsewhere. So some variation in the budget is fine. The issue we have with health is the systematic nature of the repeated overruns and the fact this year that by and large these additional spending is added into the total for 2018 and becomes part of the base for 2019.
Okay, thank you, Deputy McGrath. Deputy Doherty.
I want to welcome you here as well, and thank you for the report and a huge amount of data in the report and in the appendices there as well. I would maybe suggest that you could circulate it at midnight as it's going out to the press, because it leaves us in a disadvantaged position where we're commenting to something that we haven't seen the next morning, but that's just a minor issue. The issue I want to focus on is in relation to, well, a number of issues, but I want to just pick up on the issue of Brexit and the commentary in the report about, the reasonable probability that a transitional agreement may not be in place. And as you mentioned, that in the context of a hard Brexit, the reduction in terms of Irish output would be 7%, as opposed to in a soft Brexit up to a maximum of 2.8%. So the doubling of the effect. But you have also called into question again even those figures. In terms of the model that is being used that underestimates Irish labour and the intensity of Irish labour in terms of exports and how we model that and the value of exports. So and this is the second time you have done this to my knowledge, so is the Fiscal Advisory Council suggesting that the impact of a soft Brexit or a hard Brexit could be underestimated by the department's modelling, and how convinced of that are you?
Yes, I'll answer that. We've looked at this a few times, and I think you've put this question to us before, Deputy. So what we've noticed when we use the models that are typically run to estimate the effects is that they treat the UK like any other trading partner. Basically, that the labour intensity and how many people work for each export to the UK is basically the same as any other export market. But actually we know that there's way more labour involved in the types of sectors involved, like agri-foods, machinery and equipment. Much more people work for each item exported to the UK. And because of the way the models are set up, they work on typically averages and representative markets. That means that you could be underplaying the extent of the impact that might actually happen because of those labour channels being so much more important with the UK.
And do you have a view whether it is happening? Because I think that the last time I'm saying, are you talking to the department in relation to this? And are you is there a conclusion? Does the Fiscal Advisory Council, giving what you've outlined, which seems very reasonable in terms of the high intensity of the labour market on those experts, is there an opinion there from the Fiscal Advisory Council that this model is underestimating, or is it just a potential?
No, I think we're fairly happy talking to other users of models like this. So we talk to the Central Bank, to the ESRI, and to the Department to an extent that they seem to agree with the principle that this is just a feature of the model, that it does underestimate the impacts. But what the actual impact would be, you can say it will be higher, but how much higher, we can't say. It would be a phenomenal amount of work to get into that level of detail.
Okay.
And we just haven't gotten there.
No, appreciate that.
Yeah, if I could just add a single comment there, and I'm sure most people perhaps know that I also work at the ESRI, which is deeply involved in a lot of these forecasts. The sort of type of modelling that the ESRI has done and the scenarios are very much based on a sort of a long-term effect of once Brexit has happened and the sort of long-term impact that would have on the Irish economy. One of the issues I guess we raise as a risk, and the Department of Finance raises as a risk, is that we currently don't even know the timing of when Brexit will happen. And so while the long-term estimates may be exactly on point, the precise kind of transition mechanism of how quickly that would come into play is still very unknown.
Okay. Many people have said that your report has been scathing of the government's budgetary policy. There's language in these reports that we haven't seen in previous reports. You talk about non-realistic projections, lack of prudence, repeating the mistakes of this past. You draw conclusions between the stamp duty issue, but actually suggest that at that time, at least, it was taking some of the heat out of the economy, where what is happening at this point isn't. You make it clear that the budgetary projections aren't credible into some of the future. So do you expect anything to change in relation to that, or will we just have a nice note back from the Minister thanking you for your views, or what do you expect out of it? From a, you know, you put a huge amount of work into it. Everybody can see this, and there's very, very strong language in it. So what would you like to see, given that the Finance Bill has already passed the Dáil, and all that's left is really the Social Welfare Bill, which deals with probably one significant part of it, which is the fact that it doesn't budget for €250 million expenditure that is likely to happen next year, which isn't insignificant in itself.
So what we'd be looking for is that this isn't the start of a pattern that continues over a number of years. The public finances have recovered substantially over the last number of years and are in a reasonable position, but there are significant risks, and if we're not making sufficient leeway to allow for those risks, both within the public finances themselves and within the economy, that leaves us unnecessarily vulnerable. So I think the report this year was slightly different to what happened previously, but what happened this year was different. In 2017, for example, the government set out a plan and by and large stuck to it. There was within-year spending increases last year, but there was savings elsewhere to offset them. The government stuck within the amount of spending increases for 2018 at the time of last year's budget within the range that we assessed to be prudent. So we didn't use that language last year because the things we'd look for were actually in the budget. But this year those things we looked for weren't there. The government didn't stick to the plan. The budget day package was larger than they announced. We had significant, even greater within-year spending increases for 2018 with little or no savings elsewhere to offset them. Those spending increases were put into the base for 2019, and we get a very large increase in spending for 2019 relative to what was originally planned for 2018. So what would we like to see happen? Well, we'd like to see that the budget becomes credible, that the budget 2019 as set out is delivered on, that we don't get increases, and you've already admitted we're going to get $250 million of additional gross spending as the Christmas bonus will happen again next year, and further overruns on health can't be ruled out. When it comes to Summer Economic Statement 2019, we'd like to see that the government would set out a plan that was in the range that's considered prudent and then delivers on it. And if we get that, the language will be different again next year. It's a cumulative thing in terms of the budget recently passed, of things that we looked for and saw last year that we didn't see this year.
Can I ask in relation to health in particular? And this was quite frustrating for us, where we were trying to get an estimate as an opposition party of what was the likely overrun in health. And that overrun wasn't calculated by the Department of Health or Department of Public Expenditure until the days before the budget. They didn't have the information. It wasn't that they weren't providing this, they didn't have the information. So they came up with the estimate of a supplementary estimate of $655 million, 625 of it in current expenditure. The November report published yesterday shows that we've already surpassed that by 74 million euro. Current expenditure is now at 699 above profile, as opposed to 625. So, if just a couple of weeks ago they couldn't figure out what expenditure would be in 6 weeks' time, how are we ever going to get this right? Because it looks now, and given your own table, which I think is excellent in page 88 of your report, which shows that the overruns intensify at the later end of the year, we're likely to see the December figure increase that, which could call into question, do we need a second supplementary estimate in health for the last 8 weeks of the year? And that's not joking. Like, we're probably overrunning this health budget again by another €100 million, which, in your own words, is the fact that they're not credibly budgeting from health in the first place. So we define this as an overrun, but the reality is it wasn't credibly budgeted for in the first place.
Yeah, so I think to go back to what my colleague Michael said to an earlier question is, we'd like to see increased monitoring and assessment of spending, particularly in health, as we progress through the year. But it doesn't come until October that a formal figure is put out for what the likely overrun is. That by the time you get through 2 or 3 months, there should be information there that would allow a dynamic estimate of what the expected spending amount for the year is, and that we should have information on the level of spending and the level of likely overrun as we progress through the year, whether it's on target, below target or above target. So we would be advocating and perhaps agree with your own view that there should be increased monitoring, increased information made available. Health is by far the largest spending area. It's going to be over, within net voted spending, it's going to be 17 billion next year, and it's pretty clear that the overruns in recent years have a systematic pattern to them. So improved monitoring, and if the information isn't currently being collected, efforts should be made to collect it, and we'd like to see, if possible, So dynamic assessment of those overruns as we progress through the year.
Will it require...
Ben, 30 seconds in this round, and then I am going to move on.
That's fine. I can come in corporation tax later on. But in your view, given that it's already overran by 74 million above the supplementary estimate that's there without factoring in the December figures, is it likely that we will need a further supplementary estimate on the department?
We're not sure. I have to check the profile.
Yeah. So I think one issue here is when we look at the profiles, we tend to focus on the gross spending, and the overrun there is about 460 million and 420 million on health in November. So part of it could be just down to timing of when they get receipts in. So the supplementary mightn't be actually needed to increase necessarily in the next month. They might get some of the receipts that they're expecting within the department next month. I wouldn't see it at this stage.
Okay, thank you, Deputy Bailey.
I have a couple of questions. Am I okay to group them together, or
You can group them or whatever. You have 5 minutes. That's the only criteria on it.
I just wanted to get the view of the Council on the increased expenditure on capital infrastructure around schools, housing, transport, and what your view is on that. And given that we've had years of lack of investment in these areas, what do you? Now we have increasing, we are actually increasing the future productivity and capacity of the economy. I'd just like your views around that. And if the much needed capital investment was not taking place, would our deficit position be in fact better? A couple of queries then around health that I had as well. Just following up from what Pearse said, obviously we have a recruitment drive as well underway in the health sector. We have an ageing population which will put further financial strain on the health budget, and I don't think anybody questions that we need to streamline and have an overhaul at the expenditure in the health department, and maybe be more, I think Michael alluded to it, have a closer eye on it at particular points in the year. But you might just give us your view around the health budget and what you see where the biggest increases will come from within that budget, whether it is in infrastructure, staffing or general overspend. Just in relation to, you mentioned additional tax increases that you would look at, and it was on page 6. And you were talking about the summer economic statement where to be addressed. The Council assessed that these should have been funded by additional tax increases or through reallocation of existing spending. What kind of tax increases were you talking about? New tax increases or looking at existing ones? And then if you go to page 3, we're talking about significant overheating pressures could build up if a faster than expected pickup in the housing construction materialises. What is that being based on? Given that we have a huge skills shortage here, that we're not going to probably reach what we need by 2020, given that we need to reach about 30,000 new buildings a year, and that is going to take us another 2 years to get to that point, what is the level that you see overheating in the economy there? And last question, and actually goes back to health. Is it not a feature of most developed economies that a health spending overruns are not unusual?
So if I can maybe just group actually together partly your investment and some of your health questions. So in terms of investment, a couple of years ago the Council did express concern about investment, which was at a very, very low level in Ireland, low by international standards, by historical comparison, and not really enough even to keep the capital that we currently have, yet alone expand it. So it's very welcome, and we know there are big pressures on housing as well. So it's good that there is space within the budget to allow for that higher investment that is necessary. On the health side, there are pressures in many countries, as you say, come from multiple sources. Some of it is ageing, but a lot of it is cost pressures. Some of it's to do with specific drugs, as obviously it's very labour intensive, so the demand for skilled labour in that sector. So many, many pressures on the health system. I think what both of those things tell you is the importance of medium-term budget planning and good forecasts, which we haven't seen in this budget, which we saw before. It is a very big challenge how to accommodate the increase in investment, all other forms of spending and these health pressures. But that's why you need a clear plan about how you're going to do it with the revenue that's available. And how you're going to, those political choices need to be made. And this budget, because it didn't have credible medium-term forecasts, does not help in that process, because it doesn't very clearly illustrate what the choices are that people face. Now, people take different views about how they want to allocate things, but you have to have a clear baseline. And what we've seen actually is that the overall amount of spending that they've put in isn't even enough really to keep things at a constant level in real terms. It doesn't allow for enough space to improve services. It only barely allows enough to keep at the current level, and the outer years not even that. So I think these questions are political choices about how much to tax, what to spend things on, but it's vital that there's a clear framework to do that, and that's missing in this budget.
Yeah, I think the points about capital spending that we assessed it previously and do see Ireland moving from a relatively low level to a relatively high level. But the concern we'd have raised that we can't do everything. That if we are choosing to devote significant resources to capital spending, that means that in other areas we can either spend less or would have to require additional increases in tax. One point that was made around the budget is that for 2018, 2019, 2020, current spending is growing at 4.5%, which seems to be in line with the Fiscal Council's view that you can have spending increases of 4.5%, and that's fine for current spending, but capital spending this year is increasing by 27%. It's going to increase next year by 13%. So the overall increase in spending, current and capital, is much above the level that we'd have considered sustainable. And the increase in capital spending isn't a kind of a temporary spike. It's due to rise to a much higher level. So it's a structural increase from low levels to maintaining at high levels. So that growth won't then be cancelled by a subsequent fall. So the overall package of spending is quite large. So we would have assessed the increase in capital spending to be, as my colleague said, necessary to develop the capital stock in the country, but it wasn't possible to do everything. And in this budget we're seeing current spending rise at the limit of what we consider, and then put the capital on top of that, you are exceeding that.
Okay, and in relation to construction?
So on the overheating and the level of the economy, we'd agree with certain amount of the views that, one, we do need an increase in housing output. That's no doubt necessary, but is the space in the economy to do it? So the unemployment rate has fallen to 5.3%. In construction and in professional and skills related to construction, there does appear to be shortages. Either people have left the country or left the industry and aren't going to come back to it. So while housing output this year looks like being 18,000, 19,000, again below what most estimates would be for the sort of equilibrium level for Ireland, which seems to be around 30,000, 35,000. And that only gets us covering the houses we need on an annual basis. We have almost a decade of a deficit to meet, so we need housing output to rise significantly above 30,000. And that could happen, but would only happen, hopefully temporarily, that we might rise to 50,000 to meet the 30,000 we need and to cover some of the deficit that's built up over the last number of years. And that could be a temporary or unsustainable level of output. Housing is very tax rich, so it could have an impact on the public finances and could lead to a temporary increase in demand in the economy. So our concern would be that you try to avoid such overheating pressures. Have the houses been built? Like, we do all recognise that more houses need to be built, but again, you can't do everything. That if it does require taking some money out of the economy to make the resource space, to provide the resources for that housing construction, that we should be aware of what's happening and take some heat out of the economy if necessary.
Thanks, Seamus.
Dr. Billy. Next up, I have Deputy Lahart.
Thanks, Chair. Happy Christmas to you and your officials, and thanks again for your public service and your regular attendance here. So just a couple of questions. So, to paraphrase a phrase, it seems that when the government has it, it spends it. That seems to be the message that you're conveying today. In relation to the health spending, when you have a couple of questions around that. When you drill down into it, because I think there's an expectation that, notwithstanding what Sebastian said, that when there's a serious overrun, that maybe there's one particular aspect of health spending that can account for that. It might be dealing with trolley crisis or A&E departments or whatever. But when you drill down into it, it looks like there's an equal distribution of that right across the health budget, which seems to imply that the Department of Health is becoming used to overruns and is building it into its annual budgets. So there's no one big chunk in health accounting for the overrun. Actually, each section within health seems to be getting an equal share of the overrun, and if you could comment on that. We're almost at full employment. Social protection budget hasn't declined correspondingly. Have you comment on that? In fact, it has increased. And I suppose we're just lucky that that additional 11th month windfall in corporation tax wasn't known to the government at budget time. So it's again seems to be a budget, and this is like I'm not an economist and I'm not an accountant. I'm not great with figures, but I just do remember the pain of the past, and we're still back to overruns and underestimates. And have we got any handle yet on how corporation tax is being underestimated at such a scale by the Department of Finance? Next question is, why do you think, you're not a mind reader or a crystal ball gazer, but why do you think a government wouldn't factor in Christmas bonus payment for 2019? Now, since last April, everybody who came before this Budgetary Oversight Committee, whether it was yourselves, whether it was the ESRI, whether it was the Minister himself, and any other agencies and witnesses who came, they highlighted 4 or 5 themes. Our over-reliance on corporation tax. So the question is, do you think the government has done anything in this budget, aside from the rainy day fund, to address that in a tangible way? The other thing was, other measure was carbon tax. Third measure was petrol and diesel equalisation. So the government has fudged those 2 as the day after a major climate change report reinforced the urgency of taking measures to deal with it. I'm just wondering what your response to that is. And one final question concerns what you're talking about. You mentioned the oversight and a need for increased monitoring. What department's responsibility is that? Because we invited deeper here before the committee and before you came in. You know, we have correspondence from them saying that, having considered the matter carefully, the health budget isn't really a matter for them, it's a matter for the Department of Health. Now, we've responded, or we're going to respond. So who do you have in mind as having that oversight invigilation responsibility when it comes to overruns in the health budget? Because the Minister in his budget speech indicated that he would have Simon Harris into his office on a regular basis over 2019 to check out how the budget was going. And what kind of structures do you think we can put in place? And the final point is, you've hinted at it, this overrun pattern is becoming contagious. It's not applying only to health, it's now applying to education, it's applying to justice. So what advices or response have you got to that? Thanks, Chair. They're all my questions.
Thank you. We'll divide those amongst us. Just take a few to start.
Okay. When you talk about when we have money, we spend it. I've certainly been through many decades in the Department of Finance looking at this happening time after time. And while the Minister would say at this point that we're not spending all that we could spend, is still spending more than we think is appropriate at this point in the cycle. And he also says that, well, all the other parties tell us we should be doing more, so how can we avoid doing it? But I mean, one of the reasons the Fiscal Advisory Council was set up was to try and stop this cycle of spending more and more in good times and then having to have big cutbacks in bad times. So we certainly have to try and push that view and try and convince both the Parliament and the people that there is a better way that could save us from the big cutbacks when we inevitably get into a slowdown So even though we wouldn't say that, well, we wouldn't say that what's going on now is hugely over-expansionary compared with some of the things that happened in the past, it's still leaving us back, moving in the same direction as we had been moving in the past, and not learning from the past. The Christmas bonus, I know, was never put into the estimates. And no matter how many times officials and people like the Advisory Council would say, you must put it in, you're going to spend it. Governments always, and of all hues, seem to think, no, we'll leave it and we'll hope there may be savings during the year that will finance it, rather than having to show it in the budget. But they're still going to spend it even if there are no savings. So we certainly think that long-standing practice should stop, that the budget is not realistic if it doesn't make provision for it, but yet another year, another budget comes and it's still left out of the figures. The widespread increases in the health expenditure, I think we haven't looked in detail at where exactly the increases are, but we're not aware of specific increases or particular areas where there are big increases. So you may be right that it's just widespread overruns in all areas, which is what happens if there are no budget constraints imposed. If people see that the budget they're given every year can be exceeded and there are no consequences, then they will inevitably be lax in implementing the budget controls. The Department of Public Expenditure is probably a bit removed from the actual day-to-day supervision of what's happening in the Department of Health and other departments. That's why we have line departments there who should be looking at it in detail. The Department of Public Expenditure should start setting down the way in which the controls should be exercised to make sure that the Department of Health is getting the information from the HSE, and that the HSE is getting the information from all the bodies under it on how expenditure is going every month and every quarter, and feeding it up eventually into the Department of Public Expenditure. But undoubtedly the Department of Health is the one who should be doing the primary control over the budget that they have been given in the budget for running the health services.
Yeah, and some of the other points, you make the point about the social protection budget largely being static over the last number of years, without the evidence perhaps of the drop we're seeing because of falling unemployment. Well, I suppose the first point to make is that the unemployment component in overall terms is actually a relatively small part of the social protection budget. It's probably in the region of 20 to 25%. Pensions will be by far the largest, and then you have other areas like child benefit, disability, etc. So the unemployment component has fallen, and has fallen significantly, but that's been offset by increases elsewhere, increases in the number of recipients. So the number of people aged over 66, as it is now, increases by around 20,000 per annum, as life expectancy has thankfully been increasing. And of course there has been increases in rates for the last number of years. So the unemployment element of it is falling, but there have been demographic pressures elsewhere that's seen the number of recipients elsewhere rising, and policy decisions to increase rates mean that the balance of the effect is roughly neutral, but the unemployment component is falling. Other elements are causing it to rise. So I don't think we'd necessarily expect to see the overall social protection budget fall, given the demographic and policy decisions that have been taken. On the rainy day fund and corporation tax, I suppose one thing that we would note is that we've continued to see corporation tax surge, and it has been pointed out by your colleague Deputy McGrath. There was further steps and further increases in corporation tax, yet the contributions to the rainy day fund aren't changing. If they are about saving some of these windfalls in preparation for negative events that might happen in the future, at present the design of the rainy day fund doesn't appear suitably dynamic enough to take into account both the windfall revenues we're receiving now and then the ability to spend it in the future. So it hasn't changed, even though the corporation tax receipts have increased. And then finally, from my perspective about some of the other overruns you mentioned and the supplementary estimates for education and justice. Why do we treat those somewhat different? Because if we look at them, particularly in relation to both education and justice, a lot of them are driven by issues in forecasting the number of people who are retiring. So if you look at the estimates, by and large, they're for superannuation. So the lump sum payments made to public servants when they retire. Now, this is expenditure is going to happen anyway, but if more people retire in a particular year, the amount of those lump sum payments this year will be greater. But essentially all that's doing is dragging spending that would happen in the future into the current year. The issue with health is somewhat different. It's not based on increasing people retired, it's based on an increase in the people being hired, and that spending becomes permanent and long-lasting. So I think there are somewhat differences into why we treat those. In education, justice and other areas, army pensions, it does look like there's these repeated supplementaries for a failure to correctly forecast retirements throughout the year. So maybe there are issues there in how those forecasts be assessed, but the impact they have on the public finances is not as severe as we're seeing with the current spending increases in health.
Okay. Thanks, Chair. Thank you. Deputy Broughan.
I'd like to, and the delegation. Just to ask you first of all about page 29 in terms of risks, our net debt ratio. And I notice we seem to be moving up the table. We've almost moved out of the relegation zone, haven't we, if it was like the Premiership or whatever. So are you happier with the overall debt risk situation? Obviously, it's still very large, but net debt seems to be reasonably under control. We have the rainy day fund, which I understand from the Minister is netted off as well. So is that an area, an overarching risk for the future, which we should be much happier with?
Yeah, so just briefly on that, so the issue with the net debt and why we choose net debt is to offset some of those assets. So the state has significant assets. So you can look at the gross debt, the overall amount you owe, but equally it's important to look at what you own. So the state has significant cash assets built up through the NTMA and various other sources. So we subtract that to get a sort of a measure of net indebtedness. And we think that remains at an elevated level. It is close to 100% of GNI star for 2017. So that is quite high. It's the fifth highest in the OECD.
Haven't we refinanced, though, a lot of our debt this year, and we're more next year, and isn't it much safer?
Oh, so the refinancing environment is relatively benign.
Yeah.
The NTMA experience significant demand when they issue bonds, far greater than the amount they're looking to raise. The rates at which debt is being issued at historically low. So the current refinancing environment is relatively benign. But I suppose Irish experience would say that can change very, very quickly. If you go back to 2006, 2007, similar comments would have been made about our ability to refinance debt and the margin that we'd have been paying relative to larger countries like Germany. So while the environment now might look relatively benign, it can change quite quickly. And one issue we might note in relation to Ireland is whether people are paying that much attention to what's going on, particularly if standard international metrics are done in terms of GDP. And like if you look at the chart, Ireland's GDP, net debt to GDP is below 60%. So people might view that as being a safe level. And we'd have the view that there should be greater use made of the alternative measures provided by the CSO, such as GNI star, and that would put our net debt ratio at 100%, which if we do require to borrow significant amounts in the future, does leave limited borrowing capacity. So at present we're just refinancing debt and doing so quite easily. But there are legitimate reasons for governments to borrow and to run deficits, and if we do hit circumstances where large deficits need to be run and perhaps should be run, we may find difficulty then in raising the amount of money and in refinancing debt. So our concern would be that the debt remains high. Yes, it's on a downward trajectory, but that we should look carefully at the level and continue to bring it down. The additional point.
I think something that we've added to the report this time is we've done some stress scenarios for government debt. So the reader has to work a bit harder to get to page 144 to see them. But I think that they're instructive, because with such a high level of debt, it's very sensitive to shocks. We know Ireland's very volatile, and so you can easily think of shocks that would either mean the debt would stop going down or that it would rise. Yeah. And if it was on an upward trajectory, that would require more drastic policy action to cut spending or whatever was necessary to improve the budget balance. So I think those scenarios are hopefully helpful to people in understanding the risks associated with these high debt levels.
And could I just ask about your assumptions at the start? I mean, however you look at this report, it's a kind of devastating critique, I think, of the Fine Gael Fianna Fáil government, which we effectively had, and of the budgets, do you ever think into the risks that we should maybe include the electoral cycle? Because it's quite striking the way you mentioned 2015. And since we've been in a kind of election readiness for the last 3 years, and we're certainly possibly on the march next year, you know, I'm thinking in the context of, say, the Taoiseach comes along at his party conference, he announces major income tax cuts over a number of years, but he has no countervailing. He doesn't tell us we're going to have, for example, carbon tax rises or whatever. He's not into sustainability. I know I'm asking a political question there, but isn't the electoral cycle, by its nature, if parties and groups, I'm an independent myself at the moment, but isn't it? He's thinking
of coming over to us.
But isn't it a considerable risk if parties don't come forward with sustainable? For example, I submitted a budget myself to which is around the 4.5 billion kind of a package to Deputy O'Donoghue, like maybe other groups did and parties and so on and so forth. But I kind of balanced it. I had sustainable, for example, like equalisation of diesel and a few other suggestions and stamp duty and so on. Some of the things actually you've kind of focused on. But isn't it a problem, along with the other? Obviously, we don't know what's Brexit is a nightmare and so on and so forth. But it is a bit of a risk as well, isn't it?
Yeah, so we agree with you. So under our own assessment of the fiscal risks for budget 2019, there's a general risk on budgetary pressures, and within that we clearly say that the political cycle may also increase near-term budgetary pressures. And as my colleague Michael has said, like, this is something perhaps that we've experienced in Ireland going back over many decades, and it's something we're aware of. So
and just
there's no doubt it is a risk.
On the positive side, you know the way you always say inevitable downturns. Inevitable downturns and so on. Well, that's just the first part of my question. But the Aussies were celebrating recently because they're going, is it a quarter century or whatever, unbroken growth. And so, I mean, I know when you look at the international situation, it would seem pretty inevitable, but maybe given other colleagues have made our infrastructural deficits and so on and so forth, desperate need for housing, that shouldn't be the case. The last point I just wanted to ask you, though, it's very interesting, net policy spending is exactly what that means, and how do you arrive at that?
So just on our view of an inevitable slowdown in the economy, we're not necessarily saying that a downturn and return to negative growth is inevitable, but we do think a slowdown in growth is inevitable. We've had very strong growth for a period of 4 or 5 years, the economy growing above its potential for a sustained period, and no economy, not even Australia, can grow above its potential forever. If an economy could do that, its potential should be higher. So what we view is that there will be a slowdown in growth, employment growth, increase in domestic demand, given the high rates we've experienced recently, and we shouldn't be expecting, as happened in recent years, to be able to continue with the quite rapid expansion in budgetary measures we've had over the last number of years, which we're now measuring with this new measure in one of our assessments of net policy spending. So we're trying to look at the impact of policy decisions on the level of spending that the government is doing. And there's various reasons why government spending changes outside of policy. So we had a previous question about changes in unemployment and the level of unemployment. And if unemployment was to go up, we don't see that as being a policy change. At present, unemployment is going down, so the savings being made there aren't in the policy change. So we subtract those and take them out. But equally, if there was to be a slowdown and unemployment was to go up, we wouldn't say that that should be detracting or subtracting from the amount of the so-called fiscal space. So that's separate. Equally, government spending can fall because of changes in the interest rates, and you've just mentioned that here. Again, that's not a policy change. That's based on the external environment when it comes to refinancing debt. So we take both of those out, and then we look at what the actual policy measures are. We look at the change in spending after adjusting for unemployment and interest, and then we look at the change in revenue, and particularly the change in revenue measures. So, for example, although you're looking at a measure of policy spending, when we tend to talk about spending, we're looking at both the tax and spending side. We use shorthand, we just keep talking about spending, but equally, like a tax cut is spending fiscal resources, is using them. So we combine those to get then the change in this adjusted measure of spending. That's the result of policy. what decisions are being taken by going through all those, and then look to see what the outcome is. So, for example, in recent years, we've seen that the rate of spending increase has been accelerating. Through 2015, 16, 17, 18, government expenditure growth has been accelerating. But on the other hand, on the tax side, things have been changing. Budgets 2016 and 2017 were revenue reducing. There was income tax cuts that reduced the level of revenue, whereas budgets 18 and 19 have been revenue increasing. You had the stamp duty change in 2018, and for 2019 you have the increase in VAT in the hospitality sector. So even though the rate of spending growth has been accelerating, once you make an adjustment for that change in revenue, it's actually quite flat, but it's flat at 5%. So it is relatively rapid. So that's what we're trying to do here, trying to assess the impact of policy on the level of spending. And for the last number of years, we've seen it growing at 5% in real terms, which we consider to be above the sustainable growth of the economy. For 2019, it's forecast to grow at 3.5%, which is perhaps right at that limit, but we always have the issue of the Christmas bonus. We were asked, why isn't it in the budget? It seems to be a historical fact that we'd like change and the possibility of health overruns. So already starting at the limit for 2019, and it could be higher. So that's what this measure is trying to do, trying to isolate the impact of policy on spending changes, because government spending changes for a variety of reasons. We think it's quite a useful addition, and it's something we intend to use over the future.
Okay. Thank you. Deputy O'Brien.
Okay. Well, we know why it's never in the budget, because it takes away the Santa effect for governments. And let's just be honest about it. I just have one question to the legislation be coming back into the chamber there in a minute for the abortion, and I have to be in there. Just in terms of the overheating, we've touched on it before around the non-residential construction. We know that if we were to ramp up house construction, we would have to dampen down that sector somewhere, probably in terms of stamp duties. But the other one I wanted to touch on, because in the new heat map that you produced this year, the other area where there's a potential for overheating is in unemployment, and obviously we're reaching full employment now. And obviously it's more difficult to dampen that down, because you can't lay people off and ignore the pressures. So how do we dampen it down? Is it a case of like investing in childcare? Is it a case of workers coming in from outside the country? I mean, what are the real ways of dampening down that particular sector?
Well, it's not necessarily about dampening down housing construction. Like, we agree that housing output is below the required levels at present and does need to rise, and probably needs to rise above the required levels for a period to meet some of the shortfalls. The issue is what happens in the overall economy, that you don't have additions and stimulus in other areas, that you make the room to build those houses. And that can be through lower spending increase in other areas, possibly even increased taxes to take some demand out of other sectors to allow room for the demand in the housing sector. So it's not about dampening down one particular sector, it's about looking at the overall aggregate of what the economy is trying to do, and increasing housing output to 30, 40, 50,000 units per year in an environment where the unemployment rate is 5.5% is quite difficult. If there's continued strong cyclical growth in other sectors, simply where are the workers going to come from to build those houses? If we have to bring them in from abroad, we have to have the room for them, both the houses themselves and the accommodation. But if there are workers coming in for other areas, it may be that we're simply asking the economy to do too much. And if we think housing is the priority, we should be making the space in the economy to allow that housing output to increase. So it's not necessarily about dampening down a particular sector, it's just about making room in the overall level of activity in the economy. And there are various ways in which that can be done.
Okay, and then on the unemployment heat map, I mean, how do we address that? Is it, again, a broad way of dealing with it, or are there initiatives that we can do to increase the workforce outside of bringing people in? I mean, one of the criticisms we always hear is that we don't have a childcare system in this country which is conducive to people being able to work longer hours. We have people who might work reduced hours because of the cost of childcare. If we had a proper childcare system, it would free up. I mean, are there any other ways outside of bringing people in from outside that we can actually be addressing some in terms of the unemployment and dampening it down?
Yes, so I think there are really two ways of tackling this. So the way that Seamus said, just in terms of the overall demand in the economy, so fiscal policy is one of the tools, reducing spending in other areas, holding it back a bit, or increasing taxes. But I think you're right also that on the supply side there are also things that can be done, and the measures that you mentioned to bring people back into the labour force through training, through childcare to help women join the labour force are all very supportive policies as well, and they have to be kind of built into the overall package. So I think it does need to be tackled on both sides of the equation.
Okay. I know Pearse wants to come back in corporation tax.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Deputy. Sir. Okay. Thank you very much, Deputy Brown. Deputy Breathnach.
Thanks, Chair. Apologies for being in late. Firstly, I'd like to thank the Fiscal Council, obviously, for the information and advice that it has been giving. As I said previously, when you're here, I'm one of the newer members of the committee and maybe one of the newer members of the Dáil, but one of the issues that concerns me is obviously that we're entering into a skilled staff shortage right across the economy. You mentioned building over 30,000 houses. The plasters, the builders and whatever are not there. If you take health services, an announcement last week of 680 additional care packages, the care staff are not there. We're experiencing this all the time on the ground. We hear announcements of new psychologists for mental health, new speech therapists and language and education, a constant drain on teachers heading to the UAE and other places to work. I suppose my question is, in the context of all these promises that are constantly being made to improve services, do the Fiscal Council look at those shortages and how they're going to be made up in terms of how the promises and commitments that we hear day in, day out on new services can be committed? Maybe it's not an area you look at, but I'd ask you to comment on that. And lastly, obviously coming from a border county, and I'm sure you did discuss Brexit and its implications, in the event of a cliff-edge Brexit, has there any analysis been done of the cross-border trade in the absence of any, which nobody wants to see, any customs or barriers to trade, and has an assessment been done on that by the Fiscal Council? I don't know whether it's an area that you fully cover, but maybe you'd care to comment.
On Brexit, so the Fiscal Council have not done direct analysis of that, but there has been work done by the ESRI and Intertrade Ireland, the enterprise agency in Northern Ireland, which shows Northern Ireland firms to be considerably more exposed than firms in the rest of the UK, and that shows kind of decreases in trade that are pretty significant. In particular, the impact is felt very much by small firms that do frequent but relatively low value transactions across the border. So the impact on the number of firms trading is a lot more substantial than perhaps the impact on the values of trade. But that particular analysis doesn't really look at sort of a cliff edge major distortion. It's not looking at major kind of checks on the border or anything. It's just looking at kind of what the impact of tariffs would be, given the high degree of uncertainty in terms of the current kind of level of whether or not there'll be a backstop or separate treatment for Northern Ireland, whether the UK stays in the customs union for a significant amount of time. It's very difficult to come up with any estimate with any degree of precision about how it would impact, except to get a sense of perhaps the ordering of priorities, for the ordering of the effect, which is that those firms in Northern Ireland will be more exposed than elsewhere. The exact magnitude of that effect is not really possible to estimate.
And on the first point about whether commitments can be delivered on it, that's not something that we explicitly assess. We do look at it in broad terms, so back in relation to the issues around housing and where the unemployment rate is, we do consider whether there's the resource capacity in the economy to deliver the overall level of activity that's desired. But when it comes to particular areas and particular professions and skills, that's not something that we assess.
Whose role is it?
Future skills need.
That's it.
Okay, right. Well then, thank you, Deputy Breathnach. Deputy Doherty, you wanted to come back in there, I think, on a question.
Yeah, if you wouldn't mind, I wanted to touch on the issue of corporation tax. You mentioned about the sustainability of corporation tax, and out to 2020, and the definition of sustainability is probably goes beyond 24 months. So I just maybe asking you to elaborate on that, because I know you were answering a previous question in relation to a report that was a number of years beforehand where you outlined. But obviously, if we can only predict that those revenues will be maintained at likely the current level until for the next 2 years, then that doesn't really, I don't think that equates to sustainability. And just maybe to elaborate on that, the issue, the trend is obviously increasing, and I just want me maybe to talk about the again, looking at the fiscal monitor that came out in November. The government had projected what was it, €1.1 billion above profile, 700 million of it non-recurring, with the rest recurring. Now we see November figures that it's gone up another 470 million. Possibly you might see the same in December, maybe not. But we're now over 1.5 billion above profile. We obviously have serious challenges in terms of predicting where corporation tax is at, and I assume that's also down to the fact that there's a small number of very large players that can distort the figures in a very positive way, and trying to get under the hood. But is there something that can be done, do you believe, from the Fiscal Council's viewpoint to actually look at better projections in terms of corporation tax? Because I think the most alarming thing for me in terms of the budget was that we were funding health, that necessary increase in expenditure from increased corporation tax. And while that is evident from your report in showing where the increase in corporation tax has come and the reduction in net interest rate, and then the in-year spending has increased, where it became very obvious was this year, where we got that bonanza in terms of corporation tax, and we decided to increase or to use that to fund health, and that just is madness, to say the least. It is madness. So I would just ask you maybe to comment in relation to this issue in terms of corporation tax, and I just probably wouldn't like to give the impression, because sometimes you can take headlines that the Fiscal Advisory Council says that corporation tax is sustainable, but I would argue that if you're only suggesting that it's at that level for the next 2 years, that probably isn't sustainable. That the people would rest on that to suggest that everything's okay and nothing to see here.
So just to reiterate, that's not something that the Fiscal Council has said. So that was something that I said in a different capacity. And I suppose you've asked me to elaborate that, and I could elaborate a whole lot. I think that the conclusions of the report I'd still stick by. I agree with you that 2020 isn't that much further into the distance, but I do think it would require further analysis to look and see that that's not something I've undertaken. Maybe subsequent research will be undertaken to look into that. So some of the reasons for the increases in 2015 and 2016 were assessed in the corporation tax review, and the conclusion based on the evidence at the time was that it was sustainable until at least 2020. That's a personal view, and it's one that I continue to hold. But if you want to go beyond that, I think further work would be required. On the unpredictability of it, I think to a certain extent the November receipts that were announced yesterday wouldn't have been much of a surprise because of their links to the June receipts and the way in which corporation tax is paid. So companies pay corporation tax, they make a preliminary payment in month 6 of their financial year, and they pay the remainder amount then up to 90% of the amount due in month 11. So if companies have their year end at December 31st, month 6 is June, and month 11 is November. So based on the June returns, you can get a good indication of what will happen in November. So the June returns were quite strong, and then if you extrapolate forward, you would expect to see quite strong receipts in November, and that's what we did. So it wasn't necessarily much of a surprise, but June is halfway through the year. It's not allowing you to predict at budget time. So if you want to know what will happen in November 2019, June 2019 is a good indication, but the budget of course is set already. And one issue with the predictability of it is that again, by and large, we're unsure as to the sources of it. It does likely to remain highly concentrated as the revenue will update their figures for subsequent years. We think that the concentration is likely to be maintained the same or possibly even increased, and potentially the amount being collected from multinationals could increase. Corporation tax should be increasing in an economy experiencing a cyclical upswing. It's just that we're seeing an increase in corporation tax way beyond that. And one point we make about corporation tax, it might relate to earlier points about the economy and capacity in the economy, is one area we said where you could make space is to have an increase in taxes. And we're seeing a huge increase in tax revenue from corporation tax, but it's not coming out of the domestic economy. In the main, it's coming from the multinational companies. So it's coming from another source. It's coming from outside the economy. It's coming through this international trade. It's staying in Ireland. It's flowing into the government coffers. And then, because of the delays in moving to a budget surplus, that money has been spent. So we try to assess the impact of fiscal policy on the economy. It's likely we're underestimating it. Because if you look at the balance, and particularly the primary balance, ignore the interest payments. The primary balance has been boosted by the corporation tax receipts, which are coming from an external source. So that's coming into the economy and being spent. So that's probably possibly providing a stimulus to the economy, because it's not tax revenue coming out of our pocket to be spent providing services to us. It's tax revenue coming out maybe out of American companies' pockets being spent and providing services to us. And that's something we highlight in the report. I think the predictability of it remains quite difficult. It has clearly overshot for a number of years, but because it's not linked directly to changes in domestic economic activity, I'm not sure how we can overcome those. But as the year progresses, you can get changes. And one thing we'd note about and has been noted by the Minister himself, by the 2018 receipts, is that a certain share of it is deemed to be one-off, and that there's no way permanent increases in spending should be based on one-off receipts. In fact, we'd like to see a clearer division between annual developments in revenue and annual developments in expenditure. Because again, as said at the start, if, for example, corporation tax was declining, our position would be that there should be no change in the spending side. But what we've seen is as corporation tax has gone up, it's been linked to increases in spending. So we feel that maybe half our advice will be listened to. Will be ignored now when we say there shouldn't be spending increases. If corporation tax was to decline and we were to hold our consistent position, people would say, oh, the Fiscal Council are happy for spending to stay at the high level. They said it shouldn't decline, but the issue is it shouldn't go up now to avoid that decline in the future.
Sorry, could I?
Yeah.
Sorry, could I just mention the international position? I mean, the changes in US tax codes can have a very big impact on our corporation tax revenue because of the high American presence here. The OECD, Sebastian's organisation, the OECD BEPS project, these are all things that are evolving and which to some extent have led to some of the increase in our corporation tax, but may also lead to a reduction in it in the future. I think whenever you get big increases that you can't really, or certainly weren't expecting, and to a large extent can't fully explain, you certainly shouldn't be basing long-term expenditure decisions on having that revenue forever. You need to be wary of it. So I think we would certainly be a little dubious about all of this tax revenue remaining with us in the long term. And particularly for that last $500,000 that arrived yesterday, and we would need to know, is that one-off, or what is it? Where does it come from? Seamus has a theory about it being associated with the June ones, but if it was associated with June, surely the department would have added it in on budget day as something they're expecting to get, but they didn't. So we need to be very wary of it. I think that would be the main stance that I would expect the Fiscal Advisory Council to be taking.
Just very quickly. So we looked at this in a paper a few years ago. Can we forecast corporation tax better than is currently done by the department? And we looked at close to 10 different models that might be better ways of doing this. But we found that none of them were really any good. It's just a really unpredictable revenue source. It's the most volatile of the main tax heads, the least predictable. It has the largest forecast mistakes year in, year out. It proves that. And it is really concentrated. So the fact that individual firms might have a patent run out or some other kind of shock to a sector, and their profitability can lead to big changes in corporate tax receipts in a given year. And like Michael said, the international tax environment can change. So these are things beyond our control. The key is that you just don't build up a reliance of spending, long-lasting spending, on this one tax head.
Yeah, no, I think that's heard. There's two other wee points I just want to bring in. You talked about your advice being taken. The Fiscal Advisory Council has beat the drum about medium-term projections since I can remember your reports coming out, you know, but there's stronger language in this in terms of that you're saying that they're not credible, and you've actually highlighted all of the different figures on the table that you think are dubious, which is a very clear image, you know. And but you are engaging with the Department of Finance. Obviously, you engage with this committee. Like, they aren't credible. We know that. Like, if they're based on what 1.2% of expenditure increase, like, which is inflation and demographics, so we all know that that's not going to be the case. So why are they ignoring your advice in relation to that? Why are we still getting projections on medium-term budgetary that are simply plucked out of the sky, or, you know, they're not plucked out of the sky, but they're the bare minimum, which is just to stand still, and everybody and their mother and their dog knows that that is not going to be the case, that social welfare isn't going to increase for 5 years. Nobody believes that there's not going to be an extra penny put in on health above demographics and inflation. Nobody believes that, you know. So why are they not responding in that regard?
So I don't have an exact answer to that, but I think this will help. So there's actually a long-standing issue, as you say. We've been discussing it in this room or the one next door for many years. Things that actually got better. So in the last couple of years, they moved to doing medium-term forecasts that were consistent with the government stated policy. And they also produced a thing called the alternative presentation, an alternative table, which broke that down across departmental areas, which they introduced last year. And both of those things we welcomed because it was a step forward. This time they went backwards on both of those things by moving back to these technical assumptions that don't really mean anything. And then in the alternative presentation, which is this very helpful breakdown by department that might have helped them on health, they put in numbers that were very, very low, and they had a big unallocated amount. So that's one of the reasons that we use very strong language, because not only is this the wrong way of going about it, and I think that's widely accepted, but it's a slip backwards. And I think part of the reason why it's happened is because the commitments about the medium term have weakened as well. Because forecasting for the medium term is actually not that difficult. Like all forecasts, you'll make mistakes, but forecasting spending based on the demographics and the prices is not that hard to do. It's one of the easier bits of the forecasting that we do on the council. The really difficult bit is forecasting policy. And what they did in recent years was they had this stated policy that they would outperform the EU fiscal rules. And what they're actually doing is planning to spend more or less what the expenditure benchmark would allow them to do as a guide. They didn't have to meet it, they took it as a guide. And so that allowed them then to do the rest, which is to work out the forecast that was consistent with that. Unfortunately, they don't reference that commitment anymore. They don't reference the debt, the GDP commitment. And so by weakening their medium-term fiscal commitments, by having less of an anchor, by just having this policy to run surpluses and do the right thing kind of as long as they can, that means they haven't got anything that they can translate into their forecast. So it's not really a technical forecasting problem, it's a political commitment problem. And a thing we often get back in the letter from the Minister to IFAC responding to our report is that this can't be done because of the parliamentary terms and things like that. But we know that in the past they have made these sorts of projections that go beyond the life of a parliament. And of course, over the life of parliament, we understand that if there's an election, a new government might change the plans. But to us, there seems to be no logical reason why government can't, at least for the medium term, set out what would be the continuity of what it's doing as a baseline for others to work from.
Okay, the last...
Just briefly, one thing we've seen have been some changes in how these forecasts are made. And like, so back in the crisis, back in 2010, 2011, when the intention was to run that 3% of GDP deficit target in 2014 and 2015, the projections set out that that would be achieved, but it wasn't clear what policies would be introduced to meet that. So realistic projections were set on the basis of expectations of policy to meet the 3% deficit target by 2015. Then once that was achieved, there was a move to flat nominal forecast where there was no change of anything. You can just see the lines going across flat. And then in recent years we've seen a change to the demographics and some of the the pre-commitments being built in, but again, not realistic on what likely policy is. So these things have changed. They were probably done on a realistic basis during the crisis to signal that Ireland could deliver the 3% deficit target by 2015, done on a completely unrealistic basis then for a few years. There's some improvement recently, but we definitely feel that more can be achieved. And the overall fiscal figures set out for 2021, 2022, 2023, they are not what's going to happen. And these are the numbers that we have to assess. So it would be better if they were done on a more realistic basis. Now, I do take the point being made about some of the political issues, but a move to medium-term budgeting is going to happen. And the figures will change. The improvement will come in this forecasting, but we should be ahead of that, not waiting for it to be forced on us.
The last thing I just want to mention here, and there's many other things I could talk about because there's so much in the report, but I want to just return to the health issue. And the chairperson has a number of meetings that the committee are going to be involved in terms of looking at this health and flowing from your report the health expenditure. So, we need to start to getting this right. There's a number of suggestions that you've made in the report. For example, one which I wasn't aware of, which was the Connors report in terms of what's set out in the legislation of job increases and the number of staff, and obviously that's the main driver for the health year-on-year increases. And what I wasn't aware of was the fact that these reports were being submitted in November and October, which just makes a farce of the whole thing. You know, it's technically they're within the law because I must look back at the legislation, but it's very helpful to have that footnote. So that's something that we can pursue as a committee. But you've called for more adequate data to be made available. That the government should develop and publish more data on health expenditure than is currently provided, including monthly in-year forecasts of the expected annual outturn for health expenditure. How challenging would that be? How difficult is that? You know, is this something that they'll tell us that we can't do this or whatever? We know the challenges they have because we're not getting, as I said, we didn't know what the overrun was until days before the budget, and they're guessing, they're trying to forecast as best as they can. But how difficult would it be if they can't do that, up until a budget where they really need to do it, otherwise they're not getting the money? Then how difficult would it be to do that what is required from what has been called on by the Fiscal Advisory Council? And are there any other measures outside of the issues in terms of staff recruitment and the monthly in-year forecast that the Fiscal Advisory Council would suggest so that we could improve our forecasting and monitoring of health expenditure? And maybe coming back to the point, my view, and if we look at the HSE, we call this the overruns, but I believe it's under provisions. And the HSE tell us and have told us in the past that thanks for the budget, folks, but we can't deliver the services in relation to that. And it's not like other services, as we know, because we're dealing with the HSE managers in the areas, and they've cut down on, they've just knocked off all home care packages, and it's only palliative care now patients that are getting it. We've people in hospital. Somebody's just been admitted to or discharged today, but they've been discharged last week. The home care package isn't there because of this policy, because of the overrun. So it is, in my view, an under provision. It's an unrealistic budget as opposed to a realistic budget. So we can monitor how the health department are spending the money they have. But is there not a kind of step that needs to be before that, which is what was in the confidence and supply letter is between Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, is that they are not going to allow for unrealistic budgets and they're supposed to be independently assessed. Every budget that we've had in the last 3 years has been unrealistic, as we've seen in terms of the overspend. So a lot there, but just what's the advice in terms of, is there anything further? How difficult would it be to do monthly in-year forecasts? And what would you say in relation to making sure that the budget that is provided to the agency then that has to deliver the service is realistic? Because if it's not realistic in the first place, you're just monitoring something, but you're only monitoring that it's overrunning again.
Yeah, so a lot there. So we'll take up the requirements in a second. Just on the changes that are necessary, as Michael has suggested earlier, there are two elements to it, and we don't have a view on which side it should happen. It's perhaps that both of them should change it. There needs to be credible expenditure estimates set out in the first instance, and once those estimates and ceilings are set out that they are adhered to. Either one or both of those must change. But we are not. I don't have a view on which one it is, and it seems likely that both need to improve. That what we've seen over recent years is what we consider to be a soft budget constraint. The budget is considered to lack credibility, and that then reduces the incentive of those who operate within that budget to stay within it, because I think it's going to be revised. So we would see that improvement could be made on both sides. Improvement the credibility of the estimate as set out, and then improving the adherence to it. So I don't think we disagree on the fact that there are a number of things that can change. It's not necessarily about reducing or stopping spending. It's about improving the budgetary practice.
Thank you. I think just respond to the other points. So how difficult it will be, there's no doubt it's going to be difficult. But a good way to think of this is the very first step you need to take in getting a handle on health expenditure is understanding what's happening. And a very good way to do that, and we've learned this in the Fiscal Council from endorsing macro forecasting, is to actually try to forecast what expenditure will be. Because through doing that, you put in place a framework and a kind of system for understanding exactly what expenditure is going to be today and then tomorrow eventually, and then looking into the medium term. So forecasting on a monthly basis will allow them to actually understand what is reasonable to expect and what's happening right now. Another way to understand what's happening right now is to basically move to a better accounting system in the sector. So one thing you could say about health right now is that it's very hard to get a clear sense of how much is being spent in all healthcare. Because we don't have a kind of monthly consolidated general government and audited set of accounts for health spending. The other thing on the realistic forecast side, well, like Sebastian said earlier, what you need to do is consider two basics, like what are the demographic pressures and what are the price pressures you're going to face, which are really important in health, where price pressures tend to push drug prices higher, wage prices. So if you get those kind of two things on a more realistic footing, and it's not that hard as a starting point to get them reasonably right, then you might have, two arms improved.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Deputy Doherty. Before we draw to conclude, I mean, obviously, speaking as a member of the committee, not so much as the chair, I would have some strong disagreements with some of the views that the Fiscal Advisory Council has in relation to the budget. I do happen to think, as the Minister has indicated, it's a very solid, prudent approach that has been taken in this in a number of budgets. There are areas which I think have all been well covered by members here with their questioning today. I'm conscious on time, so I'm actually drawing this meeting to a conclusion. So I'm going to, rather than go into a number of areas, I'm going to just thank you very much to you and your colleagues.
You respond to your comment, but I think the chairperson's eyes said it all.
Well, I'm just conscious of 4 o'clock. If you want to, sorry, I'm going to let because I think there are differences of opinion. I have a feeling sometimes that you can see things as glass half full, glass half empty, and there's a lot of I think negatives which you've pointed out. You've pointed out in your previous statement on it, but I do think there's a lot of positives in the budget as well, which is just always worth mentioning. I'm conscious of, though, thanking you and your colleagues for your contribution today. We will obviously take a lot of what you said, and I know the members and the committee will engage with the Minister in relation to the points that you have raised. As I'm going to conclude, the meeting will now stand adjourned until the 11th of December.